So I'm here right now with a great friend of the Arboretum. Some of you may have heard her speak at the Arboretum before and do programs here. This is Dr. Danesha Seth Carley, who is a professor in the department, Horticultural Science Department, and director of the Center for Integrated Pest Management, and director of another center with a really, really long name that I'm not going to remember, and you won't either, so we don't need to know. So Danesha's specialty is working with and researching pollinators, especially bees. She has a special affinity for bees. So we have her out here at our Airbnb. Sometimes people don't realize it is a beehive. I guess that's probably not the right term for solitary bees.
Home.
A bee home. This is a great way to support pollinators in your garden. So tell us a little bit about some of your work. I know we've got a great book on pollinators, which I have on my shelf. Give us the actual title.
So the title is Pollinator Gardening for the South, Sustainable Habitats. And you can find it at our publisher, UNC Press, or I'm sure we are on Amazon as well.
And I've... Barnes & Noble, I know, I've seen it there. And
the libraries also have copies here in Wake County.
The libraries. So tell us a little bit about some of your work and what gets you excited here with the research.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for having me. I love being out here. This is such a magical and wonderful place, and you guys do a lot to support pollinators. So kudos to you, and be sure that you guys support the great work that they're doing here. So I come at pollinator protection essentially from the plant side, as you might guess, since I'm in horticulture and I'm a horticulture professor, although I have a master's degree in entomology as well. So, you know, I straddle both sides of things.
Yeah.
But primarily what we do is we look at how pollinator habitat can contribute to protecting specifically bees, but pollinators in general, right? So when we're protecting bees and we're being thoughtful and mindful about our landscapes, how we manage them, what we plant, we're not only protecting bees, but our other favorite pollinators, butterflies. Pollinators folks don't often think about, flies and beetles, as well as wasps. And also, of course, bats and hummingbirds and all the wonderful wildlife that goes along with that.
Right.
So we come at pollinator protection from a plant side. And what folks don't often understand is that not all plants are created equal when it comes to pollinators. Most folks probably understand that bees and other pollinators are on those plants primarily for two reasons, right? Pollen and nectar.
Right.
And plants do not produce equal quality pollen or nectar. And I like to tell people that bees, they don't read Facebook. So they don't know what plants they're supposed to like and don't like. They only know which plants give them high quality pollen and high quality nectar. And of course, in times where they are few and far between, they'll eat almost anything they can find. But we want to make sure that our recommendations for plants, for folks to plant in their gardens or in landscapes such as this, are based on scientifically sound and researched evidence. So when we make a recommendation about which plants to plant, it is truly based on research that we've done, in some cases, painstaking research. I once had a graduate student literally sit in our phytotron with one of those electric toothbrushes, knocking pollen off of flowers for 12 hours a day. Needless to say, she doesn't work for me anymore.
Yeah.
That's because she graduated and went on to a fabulous job.
Well, you know, what I always tell people when we lead tours and things, I always say, you know, the worst things that happen lead to the best stories ultimately. So that former grad student has great stories to tell their grad students when they are doing something painstaking and tedious like that. So.
Well, and that's where some of the best research comes from, right? Somebody has to do the work. And that way, because she did that work, we're now able to recommend which plants truly have good quality pollen, and other folks have done the research with nectar.
So let me ask you this, because this is very interesting to me. When you say it's got high quality pollen, is that pretty much mean it's high quality pollen for most pollinators?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when we say high quality, what does that mean, right? Essentially what that means is it's high in protein.
Okay.
So think about a meal, right? They are only eating pollen and nectar. We have the ability to do a drive-through at McDonald's, and if it were up to my 15-year-old, we would have nothing but ice cream and French fries every day for every meal, right? We might mix it up, maybe French fries for breakfast and ice cream for dinner, but that is not what I would call a high-quality or high-protein meal, right?
Sure.
So I would much rather feed them some vegetables, some rice, maybe some beans, some other protein, lots of rich, colorful vegetables. That's what I mean when I say for my kid, a high quality meal. It's the same with bees. The better quality protein they can feed on, the more strength that they will have. And of course, that's used oftentimes for their brood, the babies as well, right?
Okay.
And nectar is similar in the sense that there are micronutrients and minerals in the nectar as well. And so some have higher carbohydrate load, sugar load, and that's better because that's what they're eating when they need the energy.
Okay. Interesting. Now this is why I love that the JC Raulston Arboretum is in the university and part of the Department of Horticultural Science and has connections with the plant pathology and entomology and plant botany, plant biology, and all these other departments, is because there's a lot of information that people think is true, that feels good, that is repeated and repeated and repeated until it's just common knowledge. There's no reason to look into it because we all know it, but that's not always true. What are some of the biggest misconceptions people have, mistakes people make, that kind of thing?
Sure. So this might be a story that only true bee nerds can appreciate, but I'm going to share it anyway.
We've got some bee nerds.
I'm getting thumbs up from behind the camera. Thank you so much. So one of the misconceptions that I heard over and over when I first started doing bee research was that sunflowers were not good quality flowers for bees. Right? And most people think that sunflowers are, because you often see bees just clustered on sunflowers. And in fact, I was under the impression that sunflowers were great for bees for that very reason. I love sunflowers. They make a fantastic plant that you can grow in your yard. You have big ones, you have little ones, you have bushy ones. They're all different colors. They're a fabulous pollinator plant. But I just told you that the misconception was that the pollen was bad for bees. Well, why is that? It's because pollen from sunflowers is typically low protein, right? So we would normally say that that's the equivalent of my kid going out and eating French fries for breakfast. However, there's been some research done by Becky Irwin's lab, she's here in applied ecology at NC State, that looked into how sunflower pollen is utilized by bees. And in particular, without going into too much detail because there are papers folks can read, essentially, while the pollen is of low quality, the pollen has additional qualities that bees need, in the sense that when they eat the pollen, it actually helps the bees rid themselves of nasty gut microbes, and it helps the bees shed those microbes, and it goes out of them. How's that? I didn't know how to say that on live camera. So we all get that idea, right? So
I don't know if we know the name, but we should call out a special thank you to Becky's grad students.
Jonathan was the one who did the research I'm talking about specifically, although I'm sure her graduate students are doing additional work.
Because
yeah,
that is dedication.
He literally looked through bumblebee frass, excrement, to find out. But anyway, so long story short, it's essentially like a medicine for bees. So it is good for bees. It's just not good in terms of protein content. So if you were planting wildflowers for bees, I would include sunflowers as part of those plantings, but I wouldn't want to see anyone do sort of a monoculture of sunflowers, because then you're going to ask those bees to eat French fries every day for years, right? So you want to plant other things as well. But those sunflowers, they add that extra thing that bees need in order to stay healthy.
So what I get out of what you're saying is French fries are a healthy part of my diet, as long as I don't eat them for breakfast every day. No, so that in itself is fascinating, and that leads to the fact that we're always learning more. It's not, the knowledge isn't static there, so there's always that more. And I think that's important for people to realize that the university, the arboretum, the researchers are never content with the status quo. It's always more. What else is out there? What else can we talk about? And when you talk about, you're focusing on bees, we could have somebody here talking about birds and say, sunflowers, great seed for birds.
Correct.
But again, if you just plant sunflowers, you're feeding one type of bird, one type of seed, and it's not one size fits all.
So it goes back to how important diversity is, right? And you guys demonstrate that beautifully here at JC Raulston Arboretum. And when we talk about planting habitat for bees, and especially native bees, that diversity of planting is really important to meet the needs of all different kinds of bees.
Right, and that's, we have beehives here, which is, when people talk about bees, often what's in their mind are the honeybees, which are not actually native bees, but tell us a little bit about when you're talking about bees and the native bees, what are you really talking about?
Oh, sure, and of course honeybees are not native to the U.S. They are native somewhere.
Right. Yes.
European honeybee is what we primarily have, and they were indeed brought over on ships here, and now we really rely on them for our orchards, especially to be pollinated. But when we talk, I'm a big tent bee researcher, so I love all types of bees, large and small. And so when we're talking about native bees, just to give you a frame of reference, worldwide, there are about 20,000 native bee species. 20,000, that's a lot, right? And in the United States, we have about 4,000 native bee species. Now in North Carolina, I'm going to keep narrowing down. Right here in North Carolina, we have roughly 500 native bee species. Now that might not sound like a lot given the numbers that I just said. However, we're special. North Carolina, as with its agriculture and its soils and its people, we're truly unique in the sense that we have more individual native bee species than almost anywhere else in the South. Now, to some extent, that is because there's not a lot of research done on native bees, but also in the research that has been done, we are among the highest number of individual native bee species in the South. Why is that? In part, it's because of our diversity. I just mentioned that. Our landscapes, our agriculture, the crops and the plants that we can grow because of where we are in the transition zone. And just as a quick aside, when I used to do research in turf grass, I used to say that we grew nothing well, and but we could grow everything, right?
Right.
Because we have warm season grasses that go dormant in the winter, and we have cool season grasses that don't do so well in the summer. But actually, this area does a really nice job with all of our plants. You can even see here we are in March, and we have all these beautiful flowering plants. The bees right now are waking up. Not today because it's raining, so most of them are going to stay hidden today because most of them don't prefer to come out when it's rainy. But if it were a bright and sunny day, you would see bees buzzing all over your garden. Having the diversity of plant life that they have, particularly here at JC Raulston Arboretum, but also in our home gardens, is very important because, as you can imagine, with 500, 4,000, 20,000 different types of native bees, they're as diverse as people. So native bees can be quite small, small as 2 millimeters. Think, quite small. Think sweat bees, right? Most people can picture a sweat bee. So that's a native bee. And then almost everyone, and sometimes I have people aggressively argue against these kinds of bees, but I love all bees. The largest bee that we have here is a carpenter bee, right? And most people do not care for carpenter bees. But I'll remind you, they're also pollinators, and so they have a place, as long as it's not boring holes in my porch, right?
They're not as bad as the woodpeckers are at my house. So.
They're certainly not as loud.
Yes.
So,
with that diversity of bees, we often hear that you really have to have native plants for the bees. Where do you stand on that?
Oh, that's a fine question. So I stand where the bees stand. Bees don't care if they're native or not. Now, there can be certainly a case made for native plants, especially when we're talking about promoting native bees. However, bees need food essentially year-round. Obviously, they go dormant in the fall and they stay in their hive or in their hidey hole or in the bee hotel, hopefully.
Yes.
And then they don't come out until late February, early March. So we want to make sure that we're providing habitat, blooming resources for those bees that entire time, from March or February all the way through November. And so because of that, we want to make sure that we're selecting plants that are blooming at those times. Now, native plants, again, for native bees makes a lot of sense. The native bees, I think about 75% of native bees need special resources, right? They're not generalists such as the honeybees are. So honeybees and bumblebees, for example, will feed on anything that's suitable. But a lot of our native bees, and I might have the 75% wrong, but I do, 30 to 50% of native bees are specialists, my apologies. And so they need those specific plants or plant groups, right? Like squash, for example. And there are bees that specialize on squash plants. And interestingly enough, one of them is called a squash bee. But those bees need those specific resources. And so they have become evolved with those plant genera and with specific plants. So it's great to plant native plants because the bees already know what they've got. But I'm not anti other ornamentals. The recommendations that I like to make is make sure that it isn't going to be an invasive plant. It's not on anybody's invasive list, but if you think it's beautiful and you know that it's going to grow in your garden and you want to give it a shot, I think that you should give it a shot.
Yeah, well, and that's you know, I get to talk to all kinds of people as a generalist, you know, and when I talk to bee researchers, they talk about, you know, planting a diversity of things. When I talk to the bird folks, it's plant a diversity of things. When I talk to the pathologists, the plant pathologists dealing with diseases, or the entomologists who are dealing with the issues, the insects that are real issues, or the weed scientists, that all say plant a diversity of things. That's anytime right. You're going into a monoculture, you are overserving perhaps some things and underserving a lot more, and there is more potential for problems. So you mentioned the bee hotel, our Airbnb, which I don't know if you know this, was built by our volunteers, a couple of our volunteers. It is absolutely a work of art. The structure itself, if you're into woodworking, come out and visit the structure just to see it. But you know, it's filled right now with reeds, with logs, with holes in it, some bricks, and some other things. What you know? Tell me a little about why this works for those native bees and solitary wasps and things like this, and what we could do. What you recommend people do in their gardens to encourage them.
Sure. So essentially, I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to talk really quickly. But essentially, bees need a place to live just like we do, right? We talked a lot about the kind of food that they need, right? Rich quality nectar and pollen, but they also need a safe place to live. And a lot of these solitary bees prefer to either live in holes in the ground or in holes in sticks and twigs. They'll burrow sometimes into the stems of ornamental grasses. And this is essentially just providing them with a pre-made location where they can live. You can build something like this. It doesn't have to be to this same scale. At your home, there are some lovely plans online that you can do. It's a great project to do with kids or a scouting group.
You know who we replace these reeds every year. You much like a birdhouse, you got to clean it out. We have a fraternity that has done this for the last couple of years. They want to come in. It's it's a way to engage people with these other pieces of the Arboretum. I do have one question, because this is one I get and I don't really know the answer to. We tell people, don't clean up your garden too quickly. Leave some of those grasses and things like that. When can you start cleaning up? So when we as gardeners want to go out and start cleaning up is a little
at odds with when the bees really prefer that you clean up. And so I realized that this is the time of year we as gardeners want to start getting out, or maybe even we want to get out in November on some of those sunny days, start cutting back some of those beautiful ornamental grasses. And actually, the bees are using those ornamental grass stems in many cases as their home. And so they'll drill a hole and they'll lay their larvae. And so that will eventually emerge in March. That's a broad generalization, depends on the bee, right? But they need those reeds as their homes. And so we always encourage people, if they're tidying up their gardens, to please maybe cut those grasses, bundle them, and then leave them in a tidy corner so that when those bees emerge, they can come out and you haven't thrown them in the compost pile, or worse, burned them or hauled them off to the city dump, right? Yeah. So we recommend people wait until later in March to do that. But if you are going to do it sooner, again, bundle those grasses. You can make it a tidy little bunch, and then when people ask you why you left your grasses, you can educate them about bees.
Well, exactly. And if you have a bigger piece of property, let some areas be a little wilder in the back corners. Those are good for the birds, for all the insects, for the little critters and things like that. So amazing. Is there anything that you feel like before we go, you really should make sure people know?
Sure. So a lot of people are intimidated when they want to start pollinator protection gardens, and they think, oh, well, I have to have this, or I have to have that, or, oh, I don't have a lot of space. So I think one of my favorite takeaways that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet is that any additional resources will help bees. So you might only have a patio on which you can put plants in a container, and or maybe you have a very small area that you're able to plant. But even if you plant a small container or a large container on your small patio or in your small garden, even that will help protect bees by giving them resources and food. Because many of those bees, right, aren't only visiting your flowers, they're also visiting your neighbor's flowers, because they don't respect property lines.
That's right.
So any little bit will help. And I encourage you even just to get one rosemary plant or one herb plant like lavender or thyme, something that's easy to grow. Put it in a pot, put it on your porch or your patio, and you'll be helping the bees.